Apple has nothing on Android, okay?
Yeah?
We have folding phones. We have affordable phones that have 120 hertz displays.
Yeah?
We have budget phones. We have low budget phones. And we have a stylus that you can fit into the design.
Yeah?
We have so much superior camera systems on our phones. We've got big camera bumps, wide camera bumps.
Yeah?
We've got customized cameras with bigger sensors
Yeah?
with more megapixels than the iPhone.
Yeah?
You can get the higher USB speed data on the lower end
Yeah?
Androids. We've got Android
Yeah?
straight from Google.
Yeah?
Samsung is the king
Yeah?
of display
Yeah?
manufacturing.
Yeah?
No one can come
Yeah?
close to them. Well, let me ask you this then. Why do you think iOS market share is growing while Android is shrinking? Well, you're all stupid. That's why. Everybody's stupid for buying an iPhone.
Yeah?
Okay, I see. That's the logic. Just stupidity is why everyone's switching to iOS. Yeah, I mean, there's no other factors that go into the display refresh rate and the price and the hardware, the cameras, okay? We've got all of the hardware. Why does anyone switch? It's because they're sheep, like you, Drew. They're in a cult, okay? They're just being pressured by their friends to buy iPhones. You don't think there might be a little bit more to it than that? Or, nope, I'm done talking to you, sheep. Okay, fair enough. Let's begin. It's a battle as old as time. We've been debating the whole iOS versus Android thing for years, and the truth is I don't think there's really a right answer. Everybody just buys the phone that fits their needs best. For some things, Android is better. For other things, iOS is better. You can do what you want. I don't care. I've really enjoyed reviewing Android phones in the past, and I've even defended them in various circumstances because I know I have a very Apple-focused audience on my channel where I can still acknowledge that there's a lot of great hardware on the other side, but it's fun sometimes to take a step back and just look at the data in terms of sales, in terms of revenue, or how people are voting individually with their wallets, and see what the global trend is. You know, what are we as a species more moving towards or voting more with in terms of our wallets? And the fascinating thing is, yes, of course, Android has been in the lead for a long, long time. In fact, just a couple of years ago, Android was looking at close to 90% market share. Yes, with the added context, of course, Android has basically thousands of different manufacturers, and the most popular Android phones sold tend to be much, much, much cheaper than the most popular iPhone sold. So there is a bit of a price difference between these markets. So you have a lot of people buying Androids simply because they're cheap and iPhones are too expensive. But then if you start looking at the market share of iPhone versus Android in the over $800 segment, suddenly Apple has a pretty massive lead. So yes, Apple tends to dominate the higher end of the market, and then Android dominates the lower end of the market. But there's been a shift happening in most recent history, and I don't think very many people are talking about it, which is why I wanted to dive into it today. But for the first time ever, and this is global units, by the way, global shipments, last year in 2023, Apple occupied not 5, not 6, but 7 of the slots for top 10 best-selling smartphones in the world, okay? Not just the United States, but the entire world has moved to a point where it used to be more half and half, or Apple would have a third of the top 10, and then Android would kind of compete for the remaining 2/3 or the remaining half. But in 2023, Apple reached a point where now they are about 2/3 of the best-selling phones in the world, and Samsung is the only Android manufacturer now on that list. Years ago, there used to be several other top-selling Android phones, but now it's just Galaxy A series, actually, which is funny because we spend so much time on these channels talking about how the Galaxy foldables are doing or how the Galaxy S series are doing, and neither of those lineups actually broke the top 10 last year. It's all iPhones throughout the entire calendar year of 2023, and the most depressing part, of course, is the fact that number 1 on that list was the regular-sized iPhone 14. The phone I told everyone not to buy! Oh my god, it's so similar to the iPhone 13. This crushes my heart. It's the same chip, it's the same display, it's the same cameras. Stop wasting money, people. Actually, I think there's some interpretation up for grabs here in regards to, okay, the iPhone 14 lineup was pretty great, pretty strong, I guess. More so on the Pro side, but we'll talk about that another day. The truth is, the best-selling iPhone of 2023 was, of course, for 9 months out of the year, the newest one that happened to be the cheapest. What does that say about the buying behavior for smartphones, right? We're spending all this time with startup companies trying to figure out how to make AI assistants that can replace the smartphone because they don't need apps anymore, so that somehow makes them more futuristic, and Apple's even pouring billions of dollars into these big, heavy, fat, expensive headsets that look really, really cool and immersive for about 10 minutes, and then you go, okay, never mind, I'm done with this thing. We're spending all this money on how do we replace the smartphone? What's gonna kill the smartphone, right? Then it turns out, yeah, most people just go out to the Apple store and say, what's the newest one? I don't think that many people genuinely bought the iPhone 14 because they believed it was better than the iPhone 13. If you knew anything about the tech specs like I do, you're probably just gonna pick up the 13. If the 14 is good enough for you, I don't think average consumers were going into the Apple store going, well, I should buy the 14 because that has an extra 2 gigs of RAM. That's gonna make it last longer. No, the average consumer doesn't care about little tech specs like that. Even Apple Store employees rarely bring up the RAM management differences between different iPhone generations. They'll probably just say, well, the 14 has the better camera, and I don't know, it's just a little bit easier to repair maybe. But I think it shows that the buying behavior of the public is not necessarily to be that informed on the iPhone. Most people just want to continue using the smartphone they have until it breaks down or stops working, and then they'll go into the store, kind of like how you go into a car mechanic, or when you need a new set of tires, you just go, okay, give me the new tires, or my car's not working, why don't you just fix it? So people don't like maintaining their cars, right? They don't know how to work on them, so they take them to the mechanic and they say, you make car run again, please, and then tell me what the bill is at the end and I'll pay it. Similarly with smartphones, people just kind of go back when they need to, buy whatever the newest one is because they assume that the newest one will last longer, and then they don't want to have to think about it again. They go back to their daily lives. They're not thinking about the extra RAM they got with their iPhone 14. They don't care about the 60 hertz display. No, they just know new iPhone will last me a few more years until that breaks, and then I'll go back to the store and get a new one. No idea what the new one's gonna have going for me, but again, it's just like getting your tires or your car worked on. But simultaneously, we're noticing that Android was at about 87% market share a few years ago. Now it's fallen to about 70%. So the trend is, despite all of these boring upgrades we all complain about, oh, there's not enough differences between the iPhone 13 and 14. Look, I'm mocking myself from 5 minutes ago now. Yeah, we're all wondering when the iPhone's gonna get more interesting. Is Apple gonna do a foldable? Is Apple gonna do a periscope lens or make the iPhone more interesting by burying the selfie camera underneath the display? Then we can truly get rid of the notch or dynamic island thing. Everyone's wondering when there's gonna be this big step change or big leap in improvements, and yet over time, more and more people are going with the iPhone over the Android. You could argue that, well, maybe as smartphones become more widespread, they're shipping in more countries, reaching more developing nations that weren't quite at the same level of wealth as other nations, so they're now able to afford smartphones. But again, we all know that iPhones cost way more than most Androids. So if your argument is, well, just technology is, trickling down to other parts of the world that didn't have access to these phones before, shouldn't the Android market share be growing, not the iOS? It might be a little bit more of the opposite. There's more developed nations now that are capable of, watching YouTube videos or watching reviews, getting a little bit more informed on their purchase decisions, or Tim Cook, being the supply chain mastermind that he is getting better and better at moving inventory or getting better at marketing to different nations. And that could result in a lot more people being aware of iPhones. But then we come back to this whole thing about options and decisions and how people are deciding which phone to get, right? That was the whole skit for this video. Android usually has all the specs. Usually you can find a cheaper phone from an Android manufacturer, whatever one you want, that has a bigger battery than the iPhone, that probably has a higher megapixel camera, that could have faster charging, that could have a bigger display or a higher refresh rate. Even in blind smartphone camera comparisons now, we're seeing Android phones that are cheaper than iPhones consistently come out ahead. I'm not even trying to make the argument that I think iPhones have better cameras, because spoiler, even as an Apple sheep, I think Androids have better cameras. So what's this all coming back to? Why is iOS market share growing while Android is shrinking? I personally think the missing link, the hidden variable that people aren't considering, is software. It all comes down to the operating system and the App Store, and that's what people seem to be more attracted to, right? Like, the iPhone's not winning over people because of any particular hardware feature, right? Just a few months ago, we got Type-C for the first time, which is infinitely better than Lightning in every way, and up until that point, Lightning was kind of a deterrent. It was like, oh, you gotta have a different cable from everything else, you gotta have special headphones or adapters just for your Lightning iPhone, while everything else, including your MacBook and iPad, were relying on Type-C. Now the iPhone is finally reaching feature parity with Androids to, okay, now we have the same Type-C port, now we have great camera systems just like the Android phones do, and we have decent battery lives, but still usually physically smaller batteries than most Androids have. So people are buying them for the software, I think, in the end. The animations of iOS just being a lot more smooth and responsive. It's a hard thing to articulate, but I think people keep coming back to this. There's this natural fluidity feeling that both is found in the first-party apps and the third-party apps that you just can't get on Android, which is often why, despite against all the science saying otherwise, we still run into these situations where people feel like the iPhone with 60 hertz is a bit smoother than the Android with 120 hertz. Even though I know scientifically it's not true, of course, but the Android, because of its less optimized user interface, because of the inconsistency with third-party apps not being as optimized as they tend to be on iOS, because when you develop an Android app, you gotta optimize it for thousands of different phones, whereas if you bring an app to iOS, it only has to optimize for a dozen different iPhone screen sizes. So that simplicity and convenience and familiarity that a lot of people have with iOS, I think keeps bringing them over. And of course, there's a lot of simple OS features like iMessage, and that's definitely a huge factor in the United States. Less so overseas, where most people are using WhatsApp anyway, but I can understand how a lot of people in my country don't want to fuss around with having to deactivate iMessage and switch over to a third-party messaging platform on an Android phone. So if they have an iPhone, you might have an iOS user for life. No matter how crappy the iPhone gets or how buggy iOS gets, people just don't want to mess around with the simplicity of iMessage and FaceTime just being built in natively and working reliably. And I think the other help definitely comes into the resale market because of iPhones holding their value so much better than most Android phones do. There's a lot of different reasons that may be. It could be because iPhones tend to have longer software support, but I also think that looking at the price difference between, a lot of Android phones selling better when they're cheaper and iPhones still selling great even when they're much more expensive, that proves that if we ignored price, the iPhones are just more desirable by the public. So whenever you have that demand for it, that affects the pricing of the resale market. It's another way of saying iPhones hold their resale value better because people want more iPhones, especially in the used market. There's more demand for buying one used, whereas an Android phone, they get refreshed so often and less people are seeking them out used because they have so many different options to choose from. So there's an oversupply, and that affects the pricing, which is honestly why I think a lot of people choose to buy and flip iPhones, because they know they're going to get a better return on their investment. But Android slowly should be catching up to iOS in terms of software support as well. So I really think it comes down to the OS. I don't think it's necessarily just about the silicon on the inside. Qualcomm still has some fairly powerful chips that are pretty efficient nowadays. I don't think it comes down to iOS cameras or the iPhone hardware design. I think a lot of it could be brand power, sure, but brand power doesn't come from nothing, right? I can't just start up my own clothing company and take on Gucci because of a special amount of brand power or just getting a handful of celebrities to wear a particular brand. No, I don't think that affects the masses as something major as like global smartphone buying behavior. And it's just fascinating to watch, even though Apple hasn't really worked that hard to make iPhones cheaper. If anything, the opposite. iPhones are still going up in price, and yet we're seeing the market share grow. So Apple's doing something right here. So to all the Fandroids out there that despise Apple, I ask you, what do you think is the reason behind growing market share for iOS versus shrinking market share for Android? If it's not the operating system, if it's not the stability of the App Store, then what is it? I haven't heard a compelling argument for the alternative, and that may just be why Apple is so defensive and protective over how consistent and reliable the whole iOS App Store experience is. Because that might just be their greatest advantage, and we don't necessarily know it because it's hard to articulate. It doesn't sound like a big feature to just say, well, the scrolling and, the home screen and the simplicity of apps is the reason people choose iPhone over Android. It doesn't sound like a big technical feature, but it might be something that simple. It might be something that basic that's just hard to replicate on a non-iPhone, and that's what keeps people coming back. But what do you guys think? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you all in the next one.